Hi, everybody. This is Nate Winokur from Teaching Bud and VP of BelCosta Labs. I'm joined here by Myron and I, CEO for BelCosta Labs. Myron?
Hey, Nate. Miss working with you every day. It's been too long.
It's been way too long, buddy. I hope life on the East Coast has been treating you well. And yeah, here we're pushing forward. This specifically is about an update and how Myron specifically has been sort of carrying the torch and pushing forward for BelCosta Labs, and to give you an update on what has happened since our last update, May 14th of last year. There was a hearing on May 20th to follow up all of the information that had been collected by the judge. As you can probably guess, things didn't exactly go our way. Anything to add, Myron?
Yes, so essentially what happened is because the DCC revoked or denied our license and suspended our license just 2 weeks prior to the license expiration, and then by the time we got in front of the judge, the license has expired. The judge said because of that fact, she could not do anything in her power because there was no more provisional licenses. So essentially she said she saw that the DCC could have done something sooner. They purposely chose not to. They didn't provide us any due process, but because there was no way for her to reissue a provisional license, she couldn't rule in our favor. But she did believe that there was a problem with what the DCC did to us just by last minute suspension and then denial, not giving us a chance to fight it.
Yeah, denial of due process, and essentially a means of, in a very calculated way, closing the door and not giving any chance for considering our rebuttal to what had happened or to giving us an actual fair hearing. It was really just us fighting at that point, and a denial of due process.
So, and it turns out, Nate, the DCC even stated that they didn't read our response to the suspension. They didn't care. This was all made up.
Added insult to injury, man. No, it's so what's happened since? You've been carrying the torch. You're a lawyer, and you've been carrying the whole case basically against the DCC ever since then. Just recently, a couple of weeks ago, we saw an article published about your efforts, and that's what we wanted to cover today mainly. Anything to say about that before we lead in?
Yeah, so first of all, going through the DCC process about just trying to win our license back after they wrongly took it from us, it's been a year. It was about a year before it could actually even get to an administrative hearing. So unless you've got some deep pockets, it's hard to keep a business going and sitting vacant for a year. And now we're about probably 10 days away from hearing what the ruling is. We had a 4-day trial about 3 weeks ago that I interviewed. I questioned people from the DCC. I had our own expert witnesses on to talk about BelCosta, our quality systems, and what we did. And I hope we have positive news here in the next few weeks.
Awesome. Again, carrying the torch pretty much as a one-man show. And this article is to help bring everybody up to speed about what has happened and what the current state of BelCosta, and the DCC currently is. This article says, in a March hearing, California Department of Cannabis Control, DCC experts testified to gaps in agency practices which could affect testing results for contaminants. The March hearing stemmed from the 2025 closure of BelCosta Labs, which owed at least in part to positive tests for the mold Aspergillus. The lab had operated on a provisional license since 2018 when the California rec market opened. Questioning of the DCC experts was conducted by BelCosta CEO Myron and I, a licensed, non-practicing lawyer. According to a summary prepared by Ronay, Dr. Dr. Shandon Shi, the DCC's research scientist supervisor at its Cannabis Testing Laboratory branch, CTLB, testified that the DCC worked with the Thermo Fisher lab company, Thermo Fisher Scientific, to create custom DNA kits exclusively for the DCC, which no one else can obtain. When the DCC's results differed from the licensed lab's results, Ronay wrote, "The DCC concludes the licensed lab is wrong, even though no one outside Thermo Fisher knows what the tests actually detect." And Thermo Fisher did not respond to requests for comment. Myron, can you please go into a little bit of detail right there?
Sure. So it was a really interesting trial. The DCC put on their experts, right, that run our tests, and we uncovered a lot of information. And so the first big piece of information is that they use a system that no other lab that I'm aware of in California uses to test aspergillus. No other lab that I'm aware of in the entire US uses to test aspergillus. They use custom primers and a custom kit that nobody else uses. Now, they say they've done a validation on it, but even within their validation, the aspergillus kit that is made by Thermo Fisher has problems in it. For example, Aspergillus flavus can show up as a positive when it's a different strain of Aspergillus. It could be Aspergillus oryz, which is a completely non-toxic Aspergillus used in food production. Another interesting aspect, that I found interesting, is that the DCC's head of microbiology, Dr. Shi, he worked under Elizabeth Holmes at Theranos for 3 years, has his name on patents with Elizabeth Holmes. And if you remember Theranos, she went to prison for defrauding investors about the capabilities of her blood testing system.
Yeah, that was some pretty dubious stuff right there, man. I remember all of that. When we talk about having a kit that nobody else has, now help me kind of shape these ideas, because a few things kind of come to mind. First thing that comes to mind, if it's a kit that nobody else uses and only government has access to, but regular testing labs don't have access to, right off the cuff, that's not apples to apples, right? Like, that's literally a different technology that could potentially yield different results. And that technology that they're using to grade us doesn't actually exist for us. That's the first idea, right? I mean, that's the first thing that comes to mind. The second thing that comes to mind is...
I mean, look,
go on.
In scientific theory, right, their results, they've tested the machine, it should be accurate, but we know for a fact, and Thermo Fisher actually acknowledges, that this machine has a fault. So it is a well-known machine that has a known fault.
That makes sense. And that brings me to my second idea, which is, let's say, out of all the cannabis testing labs out there, what's a realistic number of actual cannabis tests that have actually happened for something like aspergillus? Maybe a couple of million across the world, right?
Absolutely.
If we're talking about the manufacturers who develop these kits, who have had a chance to see them in the field, to refine them in real time, to have years to ultimately perfect as best as scientifically possible to perfect these kits, we're talking about having access to these labs, the testing labs like BelCosta, having access to some of the very best tip-top scientifically sound versions of this technology of testing aspergillus. If another company, just to throw it out there, comes out of left field, and let's see how scientifically sound of an idea this is, but if another company comes out of left field and says, we can also test aspergillus, but we have almost no experience, and no, we won't let you guys compare yourselves to our kits, how reliable does that actually sound?
Yeah, I mean, it's ridiculous, Nate. There's many kits that are what's called AOAC approved, which is what should be required. And the state of California has the option to have used those AOAC kits that most labs in the state use. And AOAC goes through a third-party validation to confirm the accuracy of the results. So it's not even their own internal testing. It's a full group of other labs that test the equipment, ensure it's accurate, ensure it's validated, ensure it works properly, and then they give you their stamp of kind of approval. And the DCC should have used those. There are multiple pieces of equipment that they could have used, and they chose not to.
Very, very interesting, man. That's, it's almost unbelievable when you read through it. She also testified that the DCC's custom primers for Aspergillus flavus, a restricted variety of Aspergillus, cross-react with Aspergillus orzae, a non-regulated, non-pathogenic organism used in the production of foods such as soy sauce, sake, and miso. That's what you were talking about a moment ago. She described the two species of Aspergillus as approximately 99% genetically similar, something clearly new. Thermo Fisher confirmed in writing that the test for, quote, Aspergillus flavus may produce positive results for Aspergillus orzae. That's, So they moved forward with this information. If it's not completely clear, this is part of the case. One could say essentially the crux of the state's case against BelCosta Labs was utilizing this evidence. This means that every time the DCC reports a positive Aspergillus flavus detection, Ronay wrote, the result could actually be harmless Aspergillus orzae. The DCC has no way to distinguish between the two. The DCC chose to destroy an 8-year-old 70-person laboratory rather than spend the money to confirm whether its results were detecting a pathogen or a food organism, Ronay wrote. She testified that after discovering the cross-reactivity issue, the department still moved forward with it, continuing to pursue recalls and enforcement actions against licensed laboratories, despite its awareness that it could not necessarily distinguish between the regulated and unregulated varieties of Aspergillus. It's not just laboratories that were affected, right, Myron? I seem to remember a lot of recalls and a lot of brands pulled into that, having both their reputation put on the line and also having to essentially sacrifice and pay for even the destruction themselves of a lot of batches that the DCC deemed to be contaminated. And this information seems to really bring into question the decisions that went behind a lot of these recalls. Anything to say?
Yeah, so a couple things. One is, have you seen any Aspergillus recalls lately?
No, I have not. Good point on that.
Right.
Nope.
And
yeah,
so
it seems like things were frozen for a moment. I mean, I can only wonder why, right? Knowing that you said this was, mere weeks ago, this hearing that we're talking about. So this is leading up to it. And of course, I think the little hit that, our friends at the state ended up taking in terms of their credibility might, spell out some of that reality. Please go on.
Yeah, and then also I appreciate Alex from Weed Week and writing about this too, because it's not that interesting of a topic somewhat, but people need to know about this. Okay. And so really what's happening here is there's so many levels and errors that happen in the entire DCC process. This is just one of them. And as the article will go on, it'll talk about how the DCC could have sent the same samples out to a lab to test genetically to ensure it was accurate before recalling hundreds of thousands of dollars of people's product. I know, and at this point, the reality is Aspergillus is kind of like low-hanging fruit for recalls, right? Because it's imagine like you buy a box of strawberries at the market. When you buy it, there's no mold on it. You take it home, you put it in the fridge, and 3 days later, some mold grows on it. Well, Aspergillus is a plant. In California, people aren't radiating it. They're not killing everything off. They're trying to keep it as natural as possible so that you're getting as organic as possible of a product. And I mean, without fully radiating it and killing all the good stuff in it, you have a risk with moisture and temperature and storage conditions and so many aspects to potentially grow mold. There's a whole article, look at Oregon. they issued aspergillus testing and then pulled it back because they didn't find enough, chance of harm. Now, I'm not saying there's not chance of harm, but I don't know if there's been a person that's come forward that's had what's called aspergillosis or aspergillosis from, cannabis. Not that I'm aware of.
Yeah, there's no doubt that for immunocompromised individuals, it could be and should be a concern. But yes, as noted, Oregon pulled that back, which doesn't go without, I'm sure, some level of logic or science behind that decision. In testimony summarized by Renee, she also confirmed that the DCC uses a not accurate testing method called plating to confirm initial test results. She said the more reliable confirmation method of DNA sequencing was too expensive and had never been done by the DCC. How much is a single test, Myron? Would you say?
I don't know the exact dollar amount, but I guarantee you it's less than hundreds of thousands of dollars of recall.
That was going to be the comparison I was going to make, because I imagine a test in that range is something in the approximate pitch of a couple of $100s, a few $100s. But the cost of a recall for a brand is tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of dollars. And again, that's before we even get to reputation of, believing that somebody had contaminated material. So it's huge. Not accurate, definitely.
And I even remember
it hits hard. What was that?
Yeah. And I even remember like a brand that we worked with, had a recall, and they sent a bunch of tests out to a bunch of different labs of whatever product that they had sitting there of the same batch, and 3 or 4 labs all tested negative. So it always went back to, well, what is DCC doing? And I've got some ideas of where this possible contamination could be coming from on those brands, because we'll go on and talk about it, but it could have come from the DCC.
Absolutely. I think I recall seeing in this article that the transportation conditions were heavily compromised as well, but it's put pretty well here. Let me get to that real quick, and we'll go into a bit more detail. Dr. Jayashri Ray, the DCC's chief of lab testing branch, testified that the DCC's reference laboratory does not follow the same regulations that licensed labs are required to follow, including the DCC ships samples through the mail and other methods labs can't use. And the DCC homogenizes samples differently than labs can. DCC environmental scientist Adam Babcock testified that the DCC transported samples in non-sterile Ziploc bags and were stored without heat and humidity controls. Licensees have argued that aspergillus found by the DCC could have grown while the sample was in agency custody. That seems like another big deal. Not only are we talking about possible mischaracterizing a species of aspergillus between something harmful and something not harmful and using that to run decisions, we're also learning that the methods that the state transports and maintains samples are in ways that are generally universally known to promote the growth and to increase the possibilities of cross-contamination within the samples they're collecting. And for samples like what we're talking about here, aspergillus, which literally, like, these types of organisms occur worldwide, right? And so by basically opening something up to the elements and non-sterile conditions, it sounds like really we're kind of opening the doors on some kind of anything goes. This might be a real messed up kind of contamination scenario. Not only that, but again, using the data from these obtained samples to be able to render these massive decisions just really paints this situation as wrong. Myron, anything to say?
Yeah, I got to be honest, Nate. Our expert, when I asked him about how they handled the product, he was shocked. He's a PhD mycologist, has worked in the industry for 30, 40 years with a ton of experience, and he was just absolutely shocked and floored at how the DCC handled this product. So essentially, they pick it up in 2 places. They pick it up at a lab and they pick it up at a dispensary. And so when either way, what would happen is they put it into a bag, and then they put it into the Adam Babcock would put it into a backpack that he's never cleaned. It's not temperature controlled. He's put, I don't know, who knows how many samples in it. He would take the backpack that he's never cleaned, never sterilized, has had who knows what in it, put it in the rental car that he also never cleaned, in the trunk of the rental car, drove it in the trunk of a rental car to a, let's just call it a local police station, sheriff station, then put it into a storage locker inside the police station that he's never cleaned, never touched, didn't clean it, no idea, then left it there for a month in who knows what conditions, and then picked it back up and then either shipped it to the Northern California lab or drove it down, and again in another rental car that he never cleaned, in the trunk of that car to San Diego lab. So there are many, many, many places here where aspergillus could have been contaminated by the DCC. And that's the same essentially from picking up at a lab or picking up at a dispensary. They could have just contaminated all this product themselves. I mean, when as a lab, we store the product in a refrigerator, we store it temperature controlled, we're monitoring humidity. Aspergillus grows in heat and in with moisture. So if it's coming out of a fridge, there's usually, you've had a cold drink before, you get some condensation on it when it comes out of a fridge. Then you put it in the heat in the trunk of a rental car, and you're just giving it the perfect conditions to grow that may have never grown.
That's infuriating.
Absolutely. And then recalling the product based off of that.
Give me a moment. That sucks. There's nothing kosher about that.
Yeah.
What were you going to say?
And there's even more. On top of that, I was saying that there's even more that on top of that, they didn't even, from the dispensary, a lab is required to take 0.35% of the batch. So in the highest case, a 50-pound batch, it's an 80-gram sample. The DCC in their testimony said, yeah, we just grabbed a few, eighth jars so we have enough product for testing. They didn't take the same amount of the lab. They didn't randomly sample the product. They did nothing. They went to a dispensary. It's like, oh, we'll take 3 or 4 jars, and it is not apples to apples. It's completely different. It's horrible.
In response to the testimony, a filing from the DCC argued that BelCosta tried to convert the hearing into, quote, an abstract scientific debate about variability, fungal biology, end quote, and the limits of testing. It said the lab's case should be rejected since the denial of BelCosta's license was based on a sustained pattern of unfitness beyond testing results. It further argued that the testimony described above ultimately describe possibilities, but not evidence of what probably occurred. Would you go into that briefly? That seems like a whole heap of ridiculousness.
That's just it's hilarious.
Yeah.
I mean, they took our license saying we're a risk to public health because of the aspergillus. Then we point out that your aspergillus testing is completely horribly flawed. You have no idea if it's accurate. And then you're going to take our license because we had a couple minor errors that are low tier 1, tier 2 minor errors that are correctable. After 7-8 years of being in business, it wasn't a pattern. It was one audit. We were in business for 7-8 years. They could have used anything, but they did one audit. It was a setup, man. I mean, it was insane.
Yeah, just so when people suggest, what does it mean when you look at something like a lab, running on a provisional license for 8 years, just a reminder that professors in university get their tenure after just 7 years. Like the ability to exist for that long and to proceed as if you're a long-term company was the only thing we had in mind, and what we believed the only thing anybody would have had in mind, save for those who maybe didn't have our best interests in being able to help us sustain what we had built. And you're looking at this case possibly unraveling. This is some very crazy stuff when I read through it, because to me, it seems like it's bureaucratic gaslighting. And I've never actually said those two words in unison before, but that's really what we're looking at here. It was an attempt, to use a bureaucratic process against us. And now that holes are starting to appear in the process, rather than admit the appearance of holes, gaslighting and saying, this wasn't about fungus in the first place. So, that's just absolutely silly. And when I say silly, I mean effing infuriating. But let's finish this. Let's finish this and run it home. Strict testing for the mold Aspergillus is a controversial practice since the mold is widespread and only known to pose a health hazard to immunocompromised individuals. Oregon previously walked back a strict Aspergillus testing policy, and state authorities acknowledged that they weren't aware of anyone in the state sickened by cannabis-borne Aspergillus. It isn't clear if anyone in California has been sickened by it. In a lawsuit BelCosta filed soon after being shuttered, the lab alleged that its closure resembled other recent shutdowns where the DCC has repeatedly, quote, gamed the system where the DCC has repeatedly, quote, gamed the system with the specific intent, end quote, of depriving licensees of due process. Quote, the DCC has deployed this strategy before and very likely will again, end quote, BelCosta's lawyer, Robert Finkel, alleged in a court filing. The judge had expressed concern over BelCosta not receiving what the court would actually deem some semblance of true due process. However, she determined that there was no other legal remedy available. The case is currently before an administrative law judge. The DCC will have the option to reject her determination before BelCosta can pursue further remedies. That's it. Myron, thank you so much for, again, pushing this forward, carrying the torch, everything you've been doing to get us this far and to expose not just for ourselves, but what this agency could be doing to our whole industry.
Yeah, I appreciate it, Nate. We're going to keep fighting the fight. Even if we don't win on the administrative law, there's another appeal that we can go down, and I'm going to keep fighting it because what happened was wrong.
So wrong. Thank you for joining me, man. I'm going to try to get this out there and to everybody as soon as possible so that everybody can stay tuned to what's going on with BelCosta 1 year later. Thank you so much for joining me, man. And thank you, everybody, for watching. We'll be in touch soon.